Delighted to welcome to the podcast now a journalist, news broadcaster, a voice of calm and reason on the air, I like to think. Reeta Chakrabarti, thank you for joining us here on the British Broadcasting Century podcast.
I like that introduction. Thank you very much.
Marvellous, thank you. You never quite know if you get it right, get it wrong, miss out the titles, miss out the full CV. I was firstly encouraged, inspired to speak to you because I heard your voice as Hilda Matheson on the public service broadcasting tribute to the last 100 years of the BBC, and that was such a great concert. Anyway, BBC's turned 100. You missed it.
I was in Greece. It was at the end of August, and we were just on our way back on holiday, so I missed it, and I was really gutted because it was a fantastic thing to do. And those first pioneers, those first audio pioneers, were so sure of themselves, very sort of principled and morally driven, and they spoke such beautiful English. So it was lovely to be Hilda Matheson for 25 seconds.
Absolutely, it was a golden 25 seconds, absolutely. And so I think she wrote pretty much the first book on broadcasting by the sounds of it. So there was paving a way, wasn't it, that we now stand on the shoulders of giants.
On the shoulders of these giants.
Indeed. So BBC has now turned 100. And how long have you been part of the BBC? I know you began in radio in terms of the BBC. Tell us what was the BBC like when you entered it?
Well, I started off as a radio producer. This was in the early 90s, so I've worked for the BBC for about 30 years for my sins. And in the early 90s, we still recorded on old Ewers, if you went out and did interviews, and everything was on tape, on quarter-inch tape, and we used to edit the tape with little bits of chalk, and you would listen for the sort of sweet spot as to quite where to edit. So editing audio is always an art, but it was a really physical art in those days. And I used to love editing quarter-inch tape because you're just very much in your own world. Anyway, I started off on a BBC training scheme, which was a wonderful scheme. You were taught law for journalists, you were taught how to write, you were taught how to speak, and then I was let loose on the programmes. I did 5 different attachments of 3 months each, and I must say I was terrified because everybody seemed so accomplished, so clever. I learned a great deal. And then from then on, I got jobs in radio, initially as a producer, but I very much wanted to report. So then I became a reporter, and then I made the move to TV in the sort of mid-90s or so.
We've had guests on this podcast who have it's funny that some people who say I miss tape, I miss the feeling of it and I love it, which is clearly where you're coming from, and others who go I'm just so glad to be shot of that, I just couldn't do it. And so it's quite a divisive thing, it seems. So you've done, I heard you on the radio over the years, and then obviously seeing you now on television. At the heart of it, of course, it's news, it's journalism, shining a light on those stories for us. And then even now, we see you as an anchor in the studio, and yet something like the Ukraine conflict, we've seen you also reporting from there this year. So that the travel part of it, how's that been for you, and what does it mean to you to actually be able to broadcast and shine a light on those parts of the world for us?
Oh, it is the job. That is the essence of the job, is going out, speaking to people, seeing things for yourself, bringing back first-person eyewitness testimony, and bringing to that testimony all of those BBC values that you keep hearing us talking about, of impartiality, of balance, and also bringing a humanity to it too. I think the older I've got, the more I've understood that, a certain amount of not of personal emotion, but understanding that the emotion the audience is going to be feeling, listening to the interviewee, it is very legitimate to channel some of that. So it's very important to me, although I love presenting the news from the studio, it's also very important that I go out and about. And I think it lends me and others like me more authority as well. If the audience has seen, right, she's been out and seen it for herself, then you speak of it with more authority and from a position of greater knowledge. I have been lucky enough to do quite a lot of traveling since I've become a presenter. So yes, this year was Ukraine. I went very differently to Paris to do the French presidential elections. Prior to that, I went to Bangladesh several times for the Rohingya crisis. I spent various weeks on charity boats in the Mediterranean for the European migrant crisis in 2016 and 17. So I've done quite a lot, and it's been fantastic for me. I was somebody who, when I was younger, had very much wanted to be a foreign correspondent, but real life intervened in the form of children,
Mm.
and some women um, managed to both have a family and work abroad, and just hats off to them. For me, for various reasons, it wasn't possible, but later on, with the children
Mm.
older, I have been
Yes,
able to do it, and
you
that's
can
been
go.
lovely.
That's wonderful. Yes, we had Justin Webb on here a few episodes ago, and he was saying, correspondent overseas, loved it then. Right now, very happy to just be in London. That'll do nicely. Thank you very much indeed. So it's almost like he's got the bug's gone now. So, but
It's age and
you know,
stage, isn't it? Whereas
it
for
is.
me, the bug was always there, and I was able to fulfill it a bit later on.
Wonderful. It's what is it then that's different about? I don't know whether because this podcast generally is about looking back at particularly the very early years of the podcast of the BBC, but also we can't deny as well that it feels a slightly fragile time in terms of the government of the BBC, and without going completely down that road as well, sort of want to just wave a little bit of a flag for how is it the BBC in its public service nature is different then from other broadcasters then, do you think, in terms of especially, I see when the Ukraine crisis struck, really, it seemed like the BBC could just suddenly almost, I know it's not flicking a switch and it just happens, but the number of people that were suddenly mobilized into being able to broadcast and tell that story seemed incredible.
Yes, and that is the thing about the BBC, isn't it? It's its reach. It's the fact that we do have a presence all around the world, although Ukraine, of course, in the heart of Europe. But we have the reach and we have the expertise. And Ukraine was a chance for us also to show off some of our most experienced people. Show off is not quite the right term, but they brought their experience to bear on a very difficult and very dismaying story. So people like Jeremy Bowen, Lise Doucette, Orla Guerin. I mean, I don't want to guess how long they've worked for the BBC, but I imagine it's for at least as long as I have. Clive Myrie, who is a veteran of foreign broadcasting, and that I think that's how we showed our immense range and breadth of talent. A lot of the time, of course, you don't realize, you're not really taking in the person who's bringing you the report, because that's part of the art of it. It is about the story, it's not about the journalist. But they do it so well, and they do it so, they're all wordsmiths, they're all very good at crafting language. And when I was there, I tried to do some of that too, hopefully.
Absolutely. You certainly succeeded. Yes, there you go. Here's one person saying thank you and well done, because it is that sense, that mix, I suppose, of calm but authority, and we feel we're getting the story, and you could tell people, it really felt, I think, as well, that we could see the people who were there, sometimes reporting above ground, sometimes below ground, and therefore it did have that authenticity to it, I think, but also a sense of that you get with the BBC of a certain, I don't know, calm's the wrong word, I suppose, but a certain reliability and a certain sense that we have done our research in this and our teams on this. We are bringing you the best, most authoritative version we can of this rather complicated situation, I suppose.
Good. Well, if then that means that we succeeded. And I think there was something else about certainly the first few months of the war, where we did for weeks on end co-present from either Kiev or Lviv. And I think for the audience, there was a certain amount of, oh gosh, it's that presenter who usually sits in a nice little studio in Broadcasting House in central London, suddenly standing on a rooftop in Kiev or Lviv. And I think it brought it home to people. The fact that this was going on, it touched them in a certain way. I find it hard to express exactly how, but I got quite a lot of audience feedback on social media, which was a sort of, oh my goodness, Rita, you're there, a sort of,
Mm.
a fear for me, which I think then also meant they understood, it just brought it home what a dangerous situation it was. And we, of course, are lucky. We can fly in and then we can fly out
Mm.
again, unlike the people who are having to endure it.
It has been, I suppose, an unusual. I didn't know, and I was going to speak so much quite about Ukraine when we started talking, but at the same time, it's such a huge story at the minute, of course, that rumbles on. But maybe since also those first news bulletins that I saw from there, I'm now seeing more and more people in our community. You know, I overheard someone at someone who's working in a local shop who's come over from Kyiv to moved here, you know, for a young girl who's moved here for safety. And I'm seeing it more and more in the doctor's surgery and our local church and the hospital, and getting that sense now of this is a story that is on our doorstep. Geographically, of course, it's part of Europe, and
And it directly touches you.
it does, yeah, totally. And the fact that you know yourself, you've been there, and I think there was also that moment when Clive Murray had been there, and then a week later he was guest hosting "Have I Got News for You" or something, and you think, what? This is, you
Man
know,
of many
I
talents.
know, but it's so odd that you've been there, you've come back, and now you're slotting into this side of things, and it's but it made it feel all the more real and touched us in a
Close
very
to
different
you.
way. Yes, it
Mm,
does. Yes.
mm, mm.
Anyway, we should probably mention something else as well as just this. But in terms of what's your inspirations, and when you watched before you joined BBC, before you thought of even necessarily a career in journalism, radio, TV, is there your first memories of television and radio, and did that in any way push you towards your current career, do you think?
Yes, I think it did. So I'm of an ancient old age, old enough just about to remember the moon landings in the summer of
Mm.
1969. So I was 4.5. There's no point being coy about it. And I have a very strong memory of my father sitting me down in front of our old black and white, well, they were all black and white then, black and white TV, saying, look at this, you've got to watch this, you've got to remember this. And I do, and I did.
Mm.
And it was the first major world event that I do remember. And I think it sort of probably instilled something. I mean, we were then, my father particularly would always watch the news, as I think people of his generation would do much more. You know, we have a much more fractured media now than we used to, whereas
Mm.
back then it was only, oh, however many TV channels,
Mm.
three.
Yeah.
And watching the news was part of your civic duty. So I was brought up with the news on and a certain amount of current affairs on, and there were newspapers. So I was interested in journalism from quite a young age. I thought I'd go into print actually, not broadcast. And that's where, sometimes it's just the way in which life takes you, which door opens. And it was the broadcasting door that opened for me.
Wow. So that's your way in, I suppose, for that there. Someone today who's starting out, I want to be journalist of the day. It must have, in the time you've been at the BBC, and it must have changed, well, from the days of tape to the days of digital. And nowadays you see a 17-18-year-old who's starting on TikTok and things like that. I don't know but there must be certain truths that were true then, true now, and technology changes. But what's your advice to anyone wanting to start out today in this bizarre world of broadcast media?
Well, the essential truths have not changed, which are be curious, read a lot, make sure you know what's going on, have opinions on what's going on. I mean, this might sound counterintuitive because, of course, we never express our opinion at the BBC, but it's good to know what you think. Um, and it and to test yourself sometimes, actually. Um, for any I think if you know where you're coming from, it is easier to recognize
Mhm.
whether you're about to tip over into something that's a little bit biased. Um, I would also say that you should be open to all sorts of opinions. In our social lives, we make friends with people that think the same as us, don't we? And it's good to spread yourself, good to be open to all sorts of different opinions. Thereafter, I think life is more difficult probably for people starting out than it was in my time, partly because in my time things were more informal. So when I did an academic degree, nothing to do with journalism, and wanted to become a journalist. Had no idea how. I had no contacts. We had no family connections or anything. So I just wrote off to the local radio station, the local newspaper, and a TV magazine program saying, can I just come and sort of shadow for a couple of weeks? And they all said yes. And I don't think you can do that anymore. I think everything's very centralized. It's websites, it's hugely competitive. It was competitive back then, but less formal, as I say. At the same time, given that our information communications have mushroomed in that time, there are all these other things that you can do, like you say, being on TikTok, having a blog, having your own podcast, being present on social media. And I think all of these things show that you're putting yourself about, and will help when you're applying for jobs.
Absolutely. Wonderful. The you mentioned about it's an ongoing thing, isn't it? I know that we'll never solve the BBC balance and all of these things that people throw sticks at it. But it was interesting. The latest episode of the podcast we've been doing, even early on, you could see the first time the BBC got in trouble in early 1923. They broadcast the first political debate they were going to broadcast in February 1923, that is. And at the end of this debate on communism, the audience started singing the red flag, and this is broadcast throughout the country for the first. And in the papers the next day, vicars complaining about, we didn't expect to hear the red flag sung at this thing. But at the same time, though, it shows the power of broadcasting. That actually 6 months before that, no one could have. The only way you'd hear these songs and anthems and things like that and messages were word of mouth or print. So it's 100 years on, and the BBC enters its second century. I feel for it in a way, because it's always going to be, as public service broadcast, you try and do a thing, and you're going to have rocks thrown at you from all sides, saying you're not preaching the version that I'd like, aren't you? But it's good.
That is true.
Good luck to you.
And those voices have become amplified in all sorts of ways in recent years, haven't they? But at the same time, Paul, the BBC is a unifying factor and a unifying force. Look at the huge things that have happened in the last 18 months. The death of Queen Elizabeth, people flocked to the BBC. They watched a lot of other TV too. I'm not claiming a monopoly, but they did particularly turn to the BBC because we are the national broadcaster. They did so in the happier time of the Jubilee in the early summer. In the first weeks and months of the Ukraine war, we had huge figures. During the COVID lockdowns, admittedly, people didn't have anything else to do. They were confined to their homes.
Yeah.
We had a captive audience,
True.
but they didn't have to switch us on, and they did. We had huge audiences. So, I do, we are, as you say, we are a political football, or it's just easy for people to get angry with us and gripe at us because we're not representing their point of view. But when it really counts, when there are real issues of either national tragedy or national celebration or huge international events that people are agog for, they come to us. So I hope that we are as essential as we always have been. Maybe not as consistently so in people's minds, but I really hope we are.
Absolutely. Final question. Career highlight for you. If you could relive one moment from your glittering career, is there a moment that you would want to relive?
I mean, that's such an unfair question.
It is.
How can I pick out one thing? Now, I'll just have to sort of speak without stopping and just,
That's fine.
there've just been too many things. I mean, my first very big story was the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the subsequent stories that came out of that will forever be for me a story very close to my heart. So that I've always got to talk about the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. But, other than that, I've done countless general elections, countless changes of party leader. I've traveled to all these places that I told you about at the beginning. I wonderfully did the 70th anniversary of Indian and Pakistani independence, which meant a lot to me. And I'd never been to Pakistan before. I come from an Indian family, so that was fascinating. I went to Auschwitz for its 75th anniversary, and that was every bit as unsettling and creepy as you can imagine. I could go on. I won't. It's an
Wow.
eclectic mix, but it's all been wonderful, and it's such a huge privilege to be able to report, to go to these places, to do these stories, and to report back to people, to tell people what is going on. It's just an enormous, enormous thrill.
Well, long may you continue to do just that. Thank you for joining us, Reeta Chakrabarti. Much appreciated.